Welcome to the Energy Desk, a weekly series from Mobius Risk Group analyzing the macro and fundamental trends shaping global energy markets. To take a closer look at any topics discussed on today's episode, head over to our research archive at research.mobiusriskgroup.com. Let's dive in. Zane, we are sitting here on March 7th in the early morning hours. How's it going up in Montana?
Great. The sun is out. The snow is still on the ground. And most excitedly, I'm in my office. Happy to be here chatting with you, Alex.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we got some good stuff today. Before we kick off, I saw some stats on Montana's trade relationships with Canada. Has there been any boots on the ground information, anecdotal commentary?
Everybody I talk to says prices are going to get higher. I've got this mental note in my head because I'm really curious about the price of gasoline and diesel. So every time I go to fill up my truck, I'm like, mental snapshot, photo with eyeballs. Mm-hmm. What is a gallon of gasoline? It is $3.35 for some mid-grade, $3.65 for some high octane. And I'm really curious to see if it goes higher.
Yeah, that will be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I think 98% of Montana's imports come from China or Canada. So that'll be a fun period to live through.
Good tariff time for you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, sweet. So earlier this week, we got together with Chuck Yates on his podcast and had an interesting conversation there. One of the things that we talked about was, underappreciated demand growth in developing countries for all types of energy and the relationship that has with socioeconomic outcomes. And, a few other stats came out this week that I think are interesting for people to consider outside of the crude and gas realm to start. And really that's looking at coal consumption globally and why these forecasts for peak demand, I think, are maybe not as reliable as folks want to believe they are. So I'm going to kind of break down a few stats for you to start, and then you can, give me some takes. But looking at the IEA's, International Energy Agency's, coal demand forecasts from 2020 to 2024. In 2020, they're forecasting peak demand globally of less than 7.5 billion tons. And in 2018, we were consuming about 7.76, so just under 8 billion tons. And for 2021, 2022, 2023, each year they have raised their forecast for peak coal demand consumption and real demand. And so for 4 out of 5 years and coming into 5 years, we have missed their so-called peak coal demand timeline. And we are now up to nearly 8.8 billion tons globally. So, that's just kind of a quick run through there. But one of the interesting things that I think people should kind of keep in mind for global coal demand going forward, when we look at coal plants, coal-fired generation capacity under construction, we currently have more coal-fired generation capacity under construction than we do gas-fired generation capacity under construction. And, as we talked about before hopping on this call, you're right to assume that most of that is coming from China, India, and Indonesia. But when we look at the actual numbers, we have 611 gigawatts of coal power capacity under development. Of that, just about half is under construction currently. Before I keep going on with all these numbers, what are some thoughts here?
Well, I just first, really high level, I think we've been calling for peak energy demand since before you were alive, and probably when I was too young to really even know what energy was in its BTU sense, that is. So, it's an interesting dynamic when you go back and you raise your historical forecasts, i.e. your realizations, and you're constantly taking the eraser to them. It should create some doubt about anybody's forward expectations. If you're changing what was, whatever you think is or is going to be should be highly suspect. In some ways, I think it's fairly simple, whether it be coal demand, gas demand, oil demand. until there is a significant decline in global population, it's highly unlikely that we see a significant decline in energy consumption, particularly considering what you've pointed out numerous times. There are places in the world that have a per capita consumption of, whether it be a barrel, an MMBTU, or some equivalent that are, an order of magnitude less or more than we do in, I'll call it, the Western developed nations.
Yeah, I think it really comes back to that point that, we really talked about this week as well. But socioeconomic outcomes are, I think, the correlation to energy is the highest of any other commodity group. So I think that understanding, that principle should really kind of be the primary driver in any demand growth forecasts that we're looking at for any type of energy. But I think the interesting one for coal in particular is when we're talking about limiting gas related anything in the US, Europe, kind of the Western hemisphere, what that actually means globally. And when you're displacing your, say, industrial energy consumption to regions that are just going to spin up some more coal plants, is that actually a net benefit to emissions? And I think the obvious answer to that is no. So I think it's kind of an interesting perspective to maybe zoom out and say, what does, displacing coal-fired consumption actually mean for global emissions if your true goal is to run the most efficient kind of global energy system possible and also support socioeconomic growth? Like we talked about, I think last week, you have India, 1.45 billion people, now the most populous planet on Earth. Their, crude consumption, like we talked about, is less than 2 barrels per capita per year. I think their total per capita energy consumption is like something very small, 7.5 megawatt hours per year. So,
yeah, I mean, India is certainly in the, crosshairs of the energy markets contemplation on where do we go, most specifically in the world of oil and refined products. But sticking on the topic of coal, I mean, I think there's another thing that just, makes perfect sense. Where are the world's coal reserves? The largest coal reserves in the world, well, in some ways, strangely, United States leads the pack. But United States, Australia, Russia, China, India. Mm-hmm. And, there's been, while the whole world has been in a tizzy and varying degrees for about, 2 decades, I guess maybe you can even say 3 at this point, about global emissions, those countries at the tail end of that, Russia, China, India, have been more than happy to build a new coal-fired power plant because it's easily accessible. They don't have to rely on any foreign relations to ensure that they get it. It is, relatively easy to store. It is expensive to transport it because it's heavy. But you think about the alternatives, moving nuclear fuel rods around, not the easiest thing to do logistically, moving.
And even getting the enrichment capacity and getting that approved with all the other regulatory bodies for nuclear, that's one thing. I think, your point of security aspect of coal for these coal-rich regions like Asia, I think perfect evidence for their current hesitance to shift away from coal was during 2022 when we had the global BTU shortage and suddenly Europe saying, hey, we'll pay anything for gas to get here. And where did that come from? It came from Asia. And then India goes on to have pretty significant series of just rolling blackouts. And then they had to fire up their coal-fired capacity again. So I think there's a little bit of ingrained pain or recent memory of pain regarding reducing their ability to generate electricity from domestic resources.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if you sat in a college classroom where a professor were highly likely to have a bias towards we got to save the planet, everything must be, as green as possible. But it was a lecture, a class on global energy economics. I mean, logically speaking, if you're going to be as efficient as you possibly can, you would have a relatively balanced set of generation resources.
Yeah.
If the wind isn't blowing, I've got something thermal. In the realm of all things thermal, what is the lowest cost? And then, some calculation that included the emissions impact, which I think is also like a really important question mark. Do we really understand how impactful our thermal generation resources around the world are to, I guess, the ozone layer, the atmosphere? I mean, just in my own curiosity and having gone down the rabbit hole of, when do emissions peak during the year? It was a really interesting question. I think logically someone would, conclude that, well, most of the people in the world live in the northern hemisphere. A lot of these countries we just named. I guess India has maybe kind of got a little bit of its footprint in both. But with most people either at or above the equator, I think it would be logical to assume, well, it must be midwinter or it must be midsummer when the carbon in the atmosphere is at its highest. I mean, in emissions, I'm sure it is, but it's like the release of CO2. Let's just use that one. CO2 in the atmosphere. When does it peak during the year? Based on the argument of thermal generation resources, you would think it is midwinter, midsummer, when in reality, and this is pretty fascinating, I think there's even the U.S. government's got some interesting time-lapse maps that show this. It's actually in April and May, which is pretty fascinating. A low demand period. So why is CO2 in the atmosphere the highest at that point? And we're getting way off the coal topic here, but I can't help myself because we're talking about emissions. It's due to tilling. We go turn up all this dirt and all this CO2 gets released into the atmosphere. And we use these CO2 levels measured on an annual basis for determining whether we should have a bunch of batteries and windmills and solar panels. And I'm not against any of those. That's not true. I'll say it again. I'm against windmills. To repeat one of my colleague, Matt Parker's longstanding statements: medieval technology, medieval results. Solar and batteries, I'm all for them. There's a lot of great ways to use it. Sorry, wind generation world. You're probably not listening to this podcast anyway. I am diametrically opposed to you. Going back to coal and the proximity argument, you should build coal generation resources if you have coal right underneath you. And for the U.S., it's not actually that necessary. It's an interesting opportunity. If we've got the majority of the world's coal resources, and we've got also a very healthy, if not the world's largest gas reserves. I mean, that's not really true, but at least a place where they've already been developed. Like we know how to do it. We've been doing it for a long time. Why not send this coal to somebody else, have the economic advantage of giving you what you need in greater quantity, not burn it here? I mean, it's a little bit of the NIMBY thing. Yeah. Like, hey, you guys use it and pollute the world, and then we'll point the finger at you and talk about how bad you are. But just in all people are fair and nice and treating each other equally, like, hey, we've got a lot of this and we're not going to use it. We're happy to sell it to you at a fair market price and develop more of our own generation needs through tie to our natural gas reserves. I mean, I think it would be a great plan. And then you've got the challenges and the issues that come with transporting stuff around the world, whatever the stuff it is that you're transporting. So, we have long been a coal exporter. I think there's about 3 ports in the U.S. that account for about 80% of our exports. So to meaningfully shift the amount that we are exporting, I'm sure there would need to be some expansions, probably even some new ports. If you're going to develop new port access for sending coal out to the world, you're probably going to have to then look at rail capacity. Can I get it there?
Yeah, all the stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting, just as like a kind of final summary for the coal generation, the operating coal power capacity in the G7 in 2010, we were just about 500 gigawatts. And that has come down to 2024, 292 gigawatts. So comparing that then to BRICS, so kind of the champions of the Southern Hemisphere, 2010, you have coal-fired capacity at 819 gigawatts. 2024, you've gotten up to 1,500 gigawatts. So you really do see how the kind of concentrated growth in those countries is driving that. And it's also, I think, important to recognize those are some of the countries that are driving demand for every commodity, whether it's, crude or natural gas, or kind of insert here the developing world. And as I mentioned before, kind of the socioeconomic outcome effort is, I think, directly tied to all of that.
Yeah, in some ways, it feels like we're setting up this really epic battle that I guess we are, presently in the middle of. It's like BRICS plus OPEC versus US plus EU.
Yeah.
Who's got the power? Who's determining what happens next? Supply side, I think is like where it gets really interesting, because on the supply side of our, the US EU relationship, we've got the only supply on that side of the, I guess, the line drawn between the two sides. The EU has very little global energy supply footprint. And then on the other side, you've got both clearly meaningful supply, OPEC. I mean, that's not, discounting the energy supply that India has. We're talking about coal, or Brazil has, and, a myriad of energy commodities, and, Russia being that 800-pound gorilla there. So, I don't know. It's hard to make a prediction on where we go in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, other than to say peak oil, peak coal, peak anything. We're not headed to that without some significant and lasting regulatory decision making. We simply are going to have greater need, even if there is not substantial population growth. I made that comment earlier. You'd have to have significant population decline. Flat global population, we still consume more.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the interesting extensions of that supply demand comment that you just made is when we look at the kind of next era of mineral trade. So, in the energy sphere, what is used to create the wind turbines, or to create batteries, or for EVs for the batteries, and several other kind of electrical components. In the tech sphere, you're looking at all of the semiconductor manufacturing. So what are all of the minerals that are used to kind of power this next phase of technology and energy and outside of energy? So you're looking at really the critical minerals. And we talked about this before a little bit with the Ukraine deal to try and get some rare earths and other minerals. Talked about Greenland and why that has its kind of strategic significance for potentially the U.S. But I think taking a look at the kind of 5 core groups of critical minerals and the folks who are supplying those, I think that's kind of another interesting, I guess, contrast to the coal-fired or energy kind of dynamics that we see today. So when we look at
before we move on real quick, I just want to make we haven't, because we one country whose name we haven't said, and they're not really going to be on this next list, I don't believe, at least to a much lesser degree. Australia is in this really interesting spot, a Five Eyes country who has significant gas reserves, who has significant coal reserves, who has proximity to, 2 of the, I guess, most heavily leaned on BRICS nations for global demand, India and China. They're in this like interesting spot in terms of their, the economic weight that they can throw around. However, they also have a population, and we've saw this with the build out of LNG export capacity. The labor unions in Australia arguably have more influence than the governmental decision makers. So I don't know. I'm pretty fascinated. Like 2 countries in the world that I think the go forward plans of either A, how energy resources are going to be developed, or B, how the energy commodities are going to be transported around the world are Australia and Mexico.
Yeah.
Proximity, coastlines, developed enough to make things happen. And I'll stop there. I guess maybe as a,
no, it's interesting.
Hey, listeners, when you hear news about Australia and Mexico as it relates to energy, pay close attention.
Yeah. Yeah. The difficulty of developing some of those resources in Australia is an interesting one, just kind of off the anecdotal side. The LNG export capacity in Australia, they were very quickly accelerating to become the global leader. And then, in 2018 or so, you have a lot of regulations come out where developing new resources becomes quite a bit more difficult. And then in 2022, a lot of regulations about what folks can export versus keep domestically. And now you're going to probably see Australian LNG export capacity decline from underdevelopment or underinvestment. Kind of an interesting one.
And one of the key reasons, though, is the projects that were built were significantly more expensive than you can build them elsewhere in the world. And a lot of that is the influence of those labor unions. I mean, you've even seen that just in the past several years where those workers will just walk and shut down a facility. That's hard to do in most places in the world.
Yeah.
The show goes on regardless of how angry, this group or that group is. And Australia seems to have a labor force that's willing to band together and say, nope, not doing it. Pay us more.
Yeah. 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 We just went through that last year. Okay. So looking at some of these critical minerals, I think this is kind of the next phase of supply kind of, I don't know how I would say that, but next kind of phase of energy minerals that are going to be driving a lot of kind of geopolitical conversations. And currently seeing that a lot with the tariff commentary. And, as I mentioned, Trump administration want to get in on Ukraine. So when we look at the supply of copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel, graphite, and rare earths, starting with copper, who do you think is the largest source of copper refining? So refined copper output.
I mean, I don't know. I'm gonna take a pass on each one of these and just say my guess is China for all of them. I don't know if that's right or wrong. But.
Yeah, it's a good guess. I mean, that's probably a faster way to get through this because when we look at copper, cobalt, lithium, and graphite and rare earths, China is the number one in all of those. So copper, China supplies 44% of global refined copper. Cobalt, 77% of refined cobalt. Lithium, 65%. Graphite, 91%. And rare earths, 92%.
So I think that just leaves out nickel if we're looking at the list of all things important for the electrification of the world and more technological, I guess, leanings on how we do things. Yeah.
And in nickel, they're number 2 behind Indonesia. And as we talked about last week, or, maybe even earlier this week, interesting connection between Indonesia, Vietnam, and China as the kind of anti-China movement really kicked off. China diversified into these other countries. So a lot of this supply is actually operated or owned by Chinese entities, which is a really interesting one, especially when we look at cobalt, because Democratic Republic of Congo, really just kind of the zone for cobalt. They supply about 65% of mined cobalt. And as I mentioned before, 80% of the DRC's cobalt supply is owned by Chinese entities. And there's a lot of the really interesting rabbit holes that people can go down when you look at the infrastructure investment kind of war battle between China and the G7, especially as this search for kind of critical mineral supplies and really secure critical mineral supplies kicks off. Africa is kind of that zone, and a little bit in South America too, where you have Peru cozying up a little bit with China, or really China cozying up with Peru to try and get a foothold in their mineral supply chain. Same thing in Africa. So you have potentially a really interesting dynamic shaping up where to produce a lot of the new technologies in energy and in kind of broader consumer technologies and industrial technologies and defense also, that race to get a non-Chinese influenced supply of minerals, I think will be even more important than it already is. And we'll probably see some geopolitical consequences. And one of the kind of questions that I've been pondering on this front is what that means for China's relationship with Taiwan. And just doing some math on enable China to kind of make a move on Taiwan versus not from a supply chain perspective. I think that's a pretty fascinating one for people to dig into, because when you have China's daily crude consumption running about 15 million barrels a day, about 10 of that is coming through the Strait of Malacca from mostly Middle Eastern producers. That one strait can be blockaded by India, who's building a base on the Indian Ocean side of the Strait of Malacca. And then you are left with other choke points like the Korea Strait, the Taiwan Strait, to get any commodities from any region of the world into China. So I think for China, their decision on what they do with this kind of semiconductor new technology position going forward as it relates to Taiwan, in my eyes, seems to come back to how long can they survive a blockade of their most important choke points. And when we look at just the crude side of that, because I think that's a pretty significant driver of why they're pushing so hard for EVs, why they're still building out so much coal, is really just to diversify their transportation fleet away from petroleum-derived fuels. And just the math on that, I think, as kind of the final point I have, is China's crude reserves right now, their stockpiles are at about 1.05, 1.1 billion barrels at last count. And at 15 million barrels per day gives them roughly 70 days of supply. Compare that to the U.S., where we have under 450, I believe, like 438 million barrels at last count. Pretty similar consumption. So you're at less than half of the days of supply. So I guess really the question is, does China ever feel like they can get into Taiwan and have control of a situation in less than 100 days, or just reduce their reliance on the Strait of Malacca enough that they can, survive a prolonged supply chain crisis in a way? Just kind of a side note.
Yeah, I think you're painting an interesting picture. It sounds like there's a naval battle ensuing in your head. A true blockade to the degree that, I guess you're contemplating there, I think is almost certain to be World War III. I mean,
this would be dire straits for sure.
Because you're not just cutting off the consumption in China. By doing so, you would be reducing access to deliver a barrel, from a country, say Russia, or for that matter, Iran. I mean, I think there could be a lot of posturing on that, and maybe even a couple of really big boats with some really big guns on them bobbing around on the ocean surface there, or maybe even under the ocean surface with some submarines. And, ideally it would just be posturing. But it is I think the panning back out again, the bigger picture, these rare earth minerals and these, I guess I'll call them essential minerals, copper, cobalt, lithium, nickel, graphite, they're not really produced in the places that we convert them into what we can use them for. So it's back to this transportation issue. I mean, I don't know. Logically, it makes me wonder why somebody wouldn't go in and say, hey, you guys have this here. We would like to buy it from you, and we would like to process it here.
Yeah.
It's almost laughable when we talk about things like less emissions when, we send, BTUs in some form to Asia that are part of making a windmill. How much diesel do we burn to send those products there to then burn the same diesel on the way back to bring us the windmill to then, also send them coal for their own, generation needs, heating, cooling, and the list goes on. Some of the greenest, or at least as they tout themselves, some of the greenest companies in the world are, highly involved in this.
Yeah.
One of my favorite, I think there's a case study. It's been several years since I've read it, but Patagonia consumer product goods. And they talk about how they source, environmentally friendly products, for their goods, their jackets, their pants, their shirts. And they do it all over the world, and they help these local economies. I mean, that's true. That's great. And how much, fuel are you burning to move all of this stuff around? Like, if you really were about, I guess, making a greener product and helping the world, you would set up the sourcing of the material and the production of the good all in the same place, probably deliver some of it at a low cost to the local population in these undeveloped places. And then from there, you would have distribution networks set up to really clearly minimize the number of gallons and barrels you're burning. And I don't think that really happens. It's all relative in a lot of the supply chain kind of conversation, where it's like, okay, it's not going to be perfect. You still have to transport it. The wind turbine one, I think, is an interesting one. I think we should maybe dedicate a podcast to talking about some of the break-even emissions timelines for, say, wind and solar. So how long does it take for a wind turbine to be in operation to offset its emissions from production? I think the number that I last calculated was about 13 to 15 years. A lot of those wind turbines are breaking down before they reach that 5 years. They last 5, but they need to run for 13 to,
Yeah. So, I think it's important to maybe have a more detailed conversation about that in a lot of these policy settings. But,
I already said how I feel about wind, so I'll love that conversation.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you, especially with the bird and the bats. You got to look at the birds and the bats when you talk about wind as well. Yeah. And final note on the China, blockade of the Strait of Malacca. I don't think that that's likely. I think that the regional / global impact and what that would require and who that would involve, as you said, would definitely be a pretty troubling scenario for more than just China. So I think that it's definitely unlikely, but I think that is really the conversation, is how long can China go without access to the stuff that really runs their economy.
And, there's another one too, like Strait of Malacca and what that would create in terms of geopolitical conflict. But the other one that's pretty interesting is if you think about these places with these rare earth minerals, where the reserves are, Democratic Republic of Congo, probably, one of the highest on the list, maybe less so Chile, maybe more so Peru. You look around the world, and in some of these places, there have already been some significant human rights abuses that have been, I guess, heard, but they don't seem to garner anywhere near the attention as, say, the conflict in Gaza, the conflict in the Ukraine. I mean, the whole world were getting an uproar when a bomb, a rocket, a bullet is fired and a life is lost, as they should. But we tend to sit kind of silently by when people are essentially slowly being killed by the way that they're treated to hurry up and get this stuff out of the ground.
Yeah, the Congo situation for the last couple of years has been pretty
atrocious
on that front. And it doesn't really get much coverage. And it's, as I mentioned, the rail projects and all of the investment and competition to get access to the resources for a lot of the major powers between Russia, China, and the US. I think it's definitely troubling to see. And, the conditions, to your point, you're open pit mining with, pretty primitive setups a lot of the time. So the real kind of cost of clean, quote unquote, clean technologies, I don't think is recognized quite yet, but we might see that change. It seems like there's kind of a shifting tide to really take a closer look at a lot of these. So we'll see. But that's all I got for you this week.
Well, it was a good conversation, and I think opened the door for many subsequents. Let's talk about wind.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. All right. Well, I'll catch you next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Alex. Good being with you.
Thanks for joining us at the Energy Desk. Again, this is a limited series. So if you want to hear more episodes, you'll have to let us know by hitting follow wherever you get your podcasts or by sending me a message at amelvin@mobiusriskgroup.com. See you soon. And please keep in mind, this commentary contains our views and opinions and is based on information from sources we believe are reliable. This commentary is for informational purposes, should not be considered investment advice, and is not intended as an offer or solicitation with respect to the purchase and sale of commodity interests, or to serve as the basis for one to decide to execute derivatives or other transactions. This commentary is not considered promotional material.